The right and left atria are described as the receiving chambers of the heart. They receive blood from the major veins, and then when the atria contract, they pump that blood to the ventricles. The right atrium receives blood from three sources: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And when the right atrium contracts, it pumps blood to the right ventricle. The left atrium receives blood from two sources, the right and the left pulmonary veins, and when the left atrium contracts, it pumps blood into the left ventricle. There's a structure between the two atria called the interatrial septum. It's a structure of the heart wall that lies between the right and the left atrium, and it functions to prevent blood from mixing between the right and the left atrium. We also have the right and the left ventricles, which are described as the pumping chambers of the heart, because these receive blood from their respective atria, and then they pump that blood into the body's major arteries. So the right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium, and when the right ventricle contracts, it pumps blood to the pulmonary trunk, which then goes to the right and left pulmonary arteries. The left ventricle will receive blood from the left atrium, and when the left ventricle contracts, it pumps blood to the ascending aorta, which leads into the aortic arch. Examining figure 19.9, we see that the right atrium is situated superior to the right ventricle, and the left atrium is situated superior to the left ventricle. The interventricular septum is a structure of the heart wall that's found between the right and the left ventricle. The interventricular septum prevents the mixing of the blood between the right and the left ventricles. We also have the tricuspid valve, which is referred to as the right atrioventricular valve. This valve is situated between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The valve will close when the right ventricle contracts, and in doing so, it's going to prevent backflow of blood up into the right atrium. Similarly, on the other side of the heart, on the left side, we have the bicuspid valve, which is also called the left atrioventricular valve or the mitral valve. It is situated between the left atrium and the left ventricle. This valve will close when the left ventricle contracts, thereby preventing backflow of blood up into the left atrium. So returning to figure 19.9, we see that the tricuspid valve is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Meanwhile, the bicuspid or mitral valve is found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The interventricular septum is going to prevent blood in the right ventricle from mixing with the blood in the left ventricle. Next, we'll examine the pulmonary semilunar and aortic semilunar valves. We'll begin with the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is also just simply called the pulmonary valve. This is a valve that is situated between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. This valve will close when the right ventricle relaxes, and it prevents backflow of blood from the pulmonary trunk into the right ventricle. So it basically prevents blood from going back into the right ventricle because it just came from there after the right ventricle contracted. The aortic semilunar valve, which is also called the aortic valve, is situated between the left ventricle and the ascending aorta, or simply aorta. The aortic valve will close when the left ventricle relaxes, and thereby it prevents backflow of blood from the aorta to the left ventricle when that left ventricle relaxes. We'll also see in a moment a structure called the fossa ovalis, which is an adult structure that is the remnant of a fetal structure called the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale in the fetal heart permits most blood to bypass the pulmonary circuit and enter systemic circulation, since fetal lungs are not operating a gas exchange. The foramen ovale typically closes at birth, which creates the fossa ovalis. In the adult heart, the fossa ovalis appears as a small indentation between the right and the left atrium. There are conditions called a patent foramen ovale, in which is a failure of the foramen ovale to close at birth. The patent foramen ovale can be corrected with surgery, just kind of depending on the severity of it. The fossa ovalis is found on the wall of the interatrial septum, and it marks the location of the foramen ovale in the fetal heart. The pulmonary valve is situated between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, in addition to the pulmonary arteries, because the pulmonary arteries are connected to the pulmonary trunk. Meanwhile, the aortic valve is positioned between the left ventricle and the aorta. There are string-like structures that are referred to as the chordae tendineae, which function to anchor the bicuspid and tricuspid valves to the papillary muscles. We'll examine the papillary muscles in a minute. The function of the chordae tendineae is to keep tension on the valve flaps in order to prevent those valve flaps from opening when pressure in the ventricles starts to build and increase during ventricular contraction. The papillary muscles are small muscle masses that are located within each of the ventricles that put tension on the chordae tendineae when the ventricles contract. And finally, we'll also examine the trabeculae carnii, which are straps of cardiac muscle that line the walls, the inner walls of the ventricles. And it is thought that their purpose is to reduce suction on the blood when the ventricles contract. So the chordae tendineae secure the flaps of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves when the ventricles contract, thereby preventing blood from backflowing into the atria. The papillary muscles in the right ventricle secure the flaps of the tricuspid valve, while the papillary muscles that are in the left ventricle secure the flaps of the bicuspid valve. And here we also see the trabeculae carnii lining the walls of each ventricle in this diagram.